and its participants may be captured by photography or video and used for news or promotional purposes. Standing or sitting in the aisles is not permitted. Smoking is not permitted inside any building on Brown's campus. In the event of an emergency, please walk calmly and quickly to one of the marked exits and move away from the building. Thank you for your cooperation.
Good afternoon, everybody. President Paxton, distinguished guests, faculty, staff, and students in this auditorium, plus the hundreds of individuals participating virtually. I want to welcome everyone to the launch of the second edition of Brown's University Slavery and Justice Report. It is 15 years since the first report was published, then commissioned by former President Ruth Simmons. Now, 15 years later, the current president of Brown, President Christina Paxton, has made it possible with her decision to make sure that there is a second edition. The second edition of any report or a book tells us two things. Firstly, that the report or the book was a seminal one, that it marked a moment, created a different platform, a different ground for new things to happen. Secondly, if the book or the report remains relevant, then it tells us that even though new ground has been broken, that the issues, the problems, the conditions which generated the first edition have not changed significantly. The Brown University Report on Slavery and Justice remains relevant. And because it is relevant, it is a touchstone. The Slavery and Justice Report is a touchstone for Brown because it created a general and a new ground which opened up passages through which we may walk. But it is also a touchstone because it becomes one plank, one dimension of our institutional history, which tells us that there is still some work to do. To read the report is not a refresher course in Brown's institutional history, nor about the history of the North as also entangled in slavery, and to therefore complicate the conventional history that the North was a site of abolitionism and the South was the site of slavery and plantations. No, rather, it is to understand that this America, which we inhabit today, is the result of a historical process of racial slavery. That both the North and the South were entangled with racial slavery. Such a historical fact shatters conventional historical truths in quotation marks. But more importantly, as we face that kind of historical truth, the fact of our history of racial slavery and Native American dispossession, we also turn our face to the present to ask, how do we repair historical injustice? Thus, the institutional legacy of the report is not so much the report itself, but what the report calls upon us to do today. We are at a strange time in our country's history, perhaps one like no other in recent memory. There have been calls and demands and activities for a racial reckoning, for us to think about questions of racial and social justice and inequalities. In opposition to these demands, there are other demands, other activities, other discourses that say we need to teach in quotation marks, the proper history of America. That, in quotation marks, proper history elides racial slavery, elides Native American dispossession. And in doing this kind of elision, it ignores and erases the lives of millions of human beings. Any history, in quotation marks, which suppresses the lives of millions of human beings is not a proper history, in quotation mark. It is perhaps an ideological history. An ideological history constructed to sustain the structures of domination and inequality. The Slavery and Justice Report is a different kind of history, opening up new ways for us to grapple with both the past and the present, and therefore to think about how to create different futures. That, at Brown, we have the courage to do. That we at Brown, we have a certain kind of understanding of ourselves that allows us to republish this report, speaks volumes of the institution which we currently inhabit, and speaks of the way in which many students talk about Brown. How do we make a difference? So with these words, I welcome you all to the launch. I want to, in closing, thank all the persons who made this event possible. The folks from the President's Office, from special events, from media services, from the communications office. But I also want to pay a special thanks to people from the library. It was Joe Meisel's email to me 2.5 years ago about the possibility of republishing this, along with the dean of the college's response to it, to both of us to say, yes, we can do this for first readings, that began this process. And the historian in me could not let me forget that particular email, which I looked up this morning, just to make sure I had the date right. And so, once again, welcome you all to this particular event. Let me now introduce and call upon the president of the Brown University. President Paxton is a noted economist and public health expert and has served as Brown University's 19th president. And she's a professor of economics and public policy since July 1, 2012. She led Brown in the development of a strategic plan that has positioned the university to elevate academics, develop the physical campus to support a worldwide, world-class educational experience, and support students, faculty, and staff who live and work at Brown. And I would say, as a director of the Center of Slavery and Justice, she is a fierce supporter of the center and the work we do. Thank you, President Paxton. Please join me in welcoming President Paxton.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming today, either in person or virtually, to mark what's a really very important moment, which is the launch of the second edition of the landmark Slavery and Justice Report. And Tony, I'm glad you noted that it was 2.5 years ago that this idea came about. I had a reporter ask me yesterday if this was the result of COVID. And it was like, no, it takes longer than that to do work like this, right? So I thought it was pretty interesting. This second edition does something really important. It takes something that was groundbreaking and excellent when it was first published, and it makes it even better. So it includes the original report plus newly commissioned reflective essays, and it is globally accessible, it is digital, and it provides a fully immersive and interactive experience, and we'll see a bit of it later in the program. So in addition to being digital, we also do still believe in the value of paper, at least I do. And so we've also produced a print edition, and it's beautiful. And everybody in our audience will be receiving a copy of the print publication, which will also be available in the Brown bookstore. I hope you have some way to keep it dry on your way home. So today's event and the launch of this publication offers an opportunity for us to reflect on the progress that we've made in confronting the legacies of racial slavery at Brown. Even more importantly, it's an opportunity for us to consider the critical work that remains ahead of us. And shortly, our panelists will discuss how the second edition moves our work forward. They'll share insights on the report's persisting and evolving impact on the Brown University campus and across the nation and the world. I want to start by offering my thanks to the many individuals who contributed to the expanded edition. And first, Tony Bogues, Professor of Africana Studies and Director of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, who contributed an essay and did so much to bring this event to fruition. Joe Mizell, Allison Levy, and the Brown Library, which led this project and created the wonderful new digital edition. Cass Clyett and University Communications, which supported editing and project development and gave wise advice throughout the way. The original members of the Steering Committee on Slavery and Justice, some of whom are with us tonight, and our many essayists, including faculty and staff and alumni, and all of our panelists. And I also want to acknowledge Chancellor Sam Menkoff, who's with us tonight. Sam, thanks for coming. Now, there's one person who isn't here in person, we'll hear from her briefly by video, who I want to especially thank and recognize. And that's President Emerita Ruth Simmons, who you'll hear recorded remarks from in just a few moments. And it's because of President Simmons' leadership that we're here today. Her charge to the university in 2003 was simple. It was, well, simple, but maybe not so simple. It was to tell the truth in all of its complexity and confront Brown's historical relationship to slavery. And this set a standard for rigorous and unflinching analysis that has become a model for the nation. So we owe her a lot. Since Brown's report was published 15 years ago, similar reckonings have taken place at more than 100 colleges and universities. The report also laid a really important foundation, and this is a foundation upon which we continue to work on today to make Brown a more diverse and inclusive academic community where we can all thrive as leaders and scholars. It established the value and the necessity, the real necessity of continued inward examination and ongoing accountability for the consequences of slavery and the forms of injustice still present today. So deeply troubling recent events, the killing of Black Americans, voter suppression efforts, persistent disparities in access to healthcare and housing and education and employment. All of these things, which have indeed become highlighted in the past year and a half, remind us that the commitment to equity is a perpetual march and one that, we hope we will complete someday, but it's going to take a really long time and we have to keep at it. I believe that institutions of higher education like Brown have a responsibility to continually reevaluate their progress towards equity. And it's essential that our entire community internalizes and bears responsibility in the ongoing fight for racial justice. So as we consider the impact of the report, we should also reflect on the model the report provides for higher education in confronting society's most complex issues in ways that lead to meaningful change. When universities like Brown are confronting the pressing challenges like health inequities and like mass incarceration or economic inequality or educational access, climate change, housing discrimination, I could go on. How do we do that? We address them through scholarship. The report reminds us that as a critical first step, any consequential examination through scholarship begins with truth-telling. Brown not only tolerated slavery in the 18th century, it tolerated a form of historical amnesia that lasted for centuries as we overlooked critical aspects of our own story. But we have to recall the failures of our past to inform our future. And without this transparency, we can't expect to effect meaningful change. The report also demonstrates something that is I think, very optimistic that is through this route through scholarship, taking this path through truth-telling, that when we steward the results of that scholarship carefully and thoughtfully, it can and does have the potential to lead to transformation. Some argue that studying the issue doesn't affect change, that it can't do that. I've heard that before. And, this might be true. This could be true if the work, the scholarship, merely identifies a challenge and documents its history. As we well know from this work, an institution's reckoning with slavery or any other complex issue does not and should not end with the completion of a report. If it does that, then we've probably failed. At Brown, the publication of this report 15 years ago marked a beginning, not an end. And it led to a process of transformation that continues to this day. In the years since the report was released, Brown has taken concrete steps to ensure that all students can fulfill their potential as leaders and scholars, expand our understanding of the impact of systemic racism, and advance critical conversations as the nation confronts anti-Black racism and other pervasive injustices. Some of the actions that we've taken speak directly to the recommendations of the first edition of the report. And this included the establishment of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, which is a catalytic entity for public discourse, and it's very ably led by Tony Bogues. It includes the installation of the Slavery Memorial by Martin per year, which stands as a physically prominent marker representation outside of University Hall. I can see it from my window. And I would also note the permanent endowment of the Fund for the Education of the Children of Providence. Now, those are things that were in the report. We've moved beyond that. We've moved beyond those recommendations to embrace a new standard for commitment to equity. We developed the Diversity and Inclusion Action Plan and phase 2 of that, which created really a roadmap for transforming the culture and practices that have led to the exclusions of people from historically underrepresented groups in higher education. And earlier this year, we convened a task force on anti-Black racism to develop recommendations for how we can best address anti-Black racism on campus and in society at large. Just a few weeks ago, we announced some new initiatives to expand financial aid and increase college access with a specific focus on Providence high school students, which really, again, mirrors some of the themes in the original recommendations of the Slavery and Justice Report. So with these initiatives, we embrace the work, and we work together as we develop true equity. I would say that this work, again, it's not an end. This report is not an end. It's a beginning. It's a new beginning of work that we'll continue to do into the future. So just in conclusion, I would say the Slavery and Justice Report marks just one example of how higher education can and has a responsibility to tackle society's most pressing challenges. And my hope is that in our Brown community and within higher education more broadly, we'll look to the model the report provides and apply it to other complex issues. And by doing so, we'll continue to set an example like we have for the last 15 years and serve as a leader in higher education, encouraging others to undertake a path through scholarship that leads to meaningful change. So with that, I think we can proceed with our program. I'm very excited about it. Thank you very much. I had the fortune to see President Simmons in person at a conference several weeks ago, and she couldn't be here, but I'm very glad that she videoed some remarks, and we'll hear from her next. So welcome, President Simmons, virtually. Thank you.
I am very disappointed not to be able to be with you in person to commemorate the anniversary of the issuance of the Brown University report of the Committee on Slavery and Justice, but I am so pleased to be able to be with you at least in this format. When I first set out to issue a charge to the Committee on Slavery and Justice, led by Professors Jim Campbell and Tony Bogues, I had no idea of the future import and impact that nascent undertaking would ultimately have. But how could we have anticipated its importance? For its impact would depend, of course, on the quality, insights, and value of the overall effort. But 15 years later, its quality, insights, value, and impact come dramatically into focus and are a source of immense pride for those of us involved in this important project. In truth, we didn't actually have to wait 15 years to understand the importance of the committee's work. Within months of the launch of the committee's work, and well before a final report was issued, we began to see, from the cadence and variety of inquiries from those seeking to follow a similar path in efforts to uncover their histories, that our work had struck a nerve. Why was this work immediately meaningful to so many? And why did this project pave the way for scores of similar efforts, not only in the United States, but around the world? It was clear that processing the multiplicity of factors and implications of the transatlantic slave trade for universities had been too long delayed, too long suppressed. The need for scholars to probe the myriad unexplored aspects of this important history was apparent. The fear of many that such an exploration would further divide communities made leaders hesitate to endorse the exploration of this history. It was therefore most important that the Brown process emphasize, and I dare say, legitimize how universities can successfully pursue the most difficult issues, including slavery. I am proudest of the committee's achievement in that regard. By addressing the fear that one cannot openly and fruitfully explore slavery and its consequences, they protected the ability of universities to be at the vanguard in unraveling one of the most contentious and confusing scholarly questions, particularly in the United States. This has been an invaluable contribution, and I thank committee members and our two co-chairs for having shown so brilliantly how unyielding fidelity to facts and research can so dramatically point the way, bringing order and reason over divisive polemics. Now, the university is making available a second edition of the report of the Committee on Slavery and Justice. This version of the report, in print and digital, is enlarged by a series of commentaries about the context and the impact of the report. There will also be an updated website about the report and the university's actions following the publication of the report. Returning to and enlarging the report in this way, the university shows its deep commitment to the ongoing objective of viewing its future as an institution in the context of this history. I ask the committee in its original deliberations to reflect on the obligations we hold in the present as a consequence of what we have learned about our past. That remains, in my view, an urgent task for this university, for the nation, and for the world. As a pioneering effort, the report of the committee has catalyzed other universities to grapple with their histories. That work has not abated. There are institutions just beginning such an effort. The creation of the international consortium of over 80, quote, universities studying slavery, close quote, is testimony to this. Unfortunately, many of these universities have siloed the study of slavery from the general policies around present-day diversity efforts. By opening the door wide to the implications of this history, we are far more likely to see the opportunity to bring people together in an effort to extend justice. By opening the door, our universities can fulfill with new vigor their obligation to be a venue where the most vexed questions facing society can be debated, discussed, and moved forward. What can be more important than that as a time such as this? Our country is as divided as ever over questions of race and equality. The necessary and central leadership role of the university in such a moment is clear. Will we seek to be a model for the orderly examination of such basic but all-important values? I hoped so when we began the Slavery and Justice Project at Brown. I hope so again. Thank you for your interest in these questions. I wish you the best throughout this program and as you continue the work of knowledge in the service of justice.
Once again, thank you all very much for coming. And we turn to the panel discussion part of this program. Panel discussion which reflects on the report, but which also really speaks with scholars who are what I like to call confronting historical injustice. The panelists are right beside me, Professor Marshall Chatelain, who is the Professor of History and Africana Studies at Georgetown University, and who's an alum of Brown, a PhD alum of Brown in American Studies, and who just recently won a Pulitzer Prize Award for her book. Congrats, Marsha. And who's also a member of the Georgetown University Working Group on Slavery, Memory, and Reconciliation. So very glad to have her back here. Beside her is Professor Seth Rockman, who's the Associate Professor of History, who's a committee member, and is also on the academic board of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, who's also the author of a prize-winning book, Scrapping By Wage Labor, Slavery, and Survival in Early Baltimore. Beside him is Professor Jim Campbell, who's the Edgar Robinson Professor of United States History, who was a former professor here of Africana Studies and History, and who was the chair of the committee that wrote the report and also studied the question of slavery and justice at Brown, and who has written many books. Just two I will mention. Most recent one is on Mississippi Witness, and who really has continued to think about this question about slavery and the link of racial slavery to universities. So I want to welcome all three of you and thank you very much for agreeing to be on this panel. Just the structure of the panel so that the audience is aware. Each of the speakers, beginning with Marsha and then just going to Seth and then Jim, we'll have 10 minutes, and they have those instructions by letter. 10 minutes to speak, and then there are a series of questions, some of that have already been posted, and I will refer to those questions. Then I will open the panel to Q&A from the audience. And if there are none, then I will ask a set of questions. And then in the last 5 minutes, I want to make some closing remarks as the moderator of this panel. So once again, thank you all very much. And just open the floor to Marsha, Seth, and Jim.
All right.
All yours.
Thank you so much,
Take it away.
Professor Bogues. And it's a real pleasure to be here as an alum of Brown and as someone who, Jim, I don't think you're going to say it today, but you often say, Ruth Simmons changed my life. And talk about understatements. I came to Brown the second year, I believe President Simmons was in her presidency as a PhD student. And the context in which the first report was written, it's for me, 15 years ago isn't that long ago, but to keep in mind the political landscape that we live in today, as well as the media, meaning social media landscape that we live in today, was not present. And I think that is so important when we think about the way that this work is done now. And as someone who was part of the Georgetown University Working Group on Slavery, Memory, and Reconciliation, I think that these types of inquiries really open up the question of to whom is the university accountable and who does the university serve? And so when we think about sometimes the corporatized ways we talk about universities as having stakeholders, we think of the stakeholders as the people who keep the lights on, right? The donors, the parents, the students, and then we kind of go through a list of people who we believe have a stake in the university. What I think that the Slavery and Justice Report did, it turned that whole notion on its head. What does it mean for the university to be accountable to the enslaved peoples and the dispossessed peoples who allowed the university to exist as it does? And I think for us at Georgetown University, taking up the work of slavery and memory in 2015, on the edge of the 2016 presidential cycle. I don't know if you guys remember that election. A few of us might remember that. In an era in which our students and other observers are tweeting and texting and commenting about it, in a moment in which the explosion of the cable news cycle allows this to be a story many times over, that this work opens a question about who is observing the university and who feels like they have access to its history. And so one of the things that I found instructive working at Georgetown on this issue and turning to Brown's Slavery and Justice Report is that this work is incredibly bold, but there's a certain kind of quiet that surrounded it because the climate was quiet. I remember the overreaction to Ruth Simmons making this decision and the trolling and the comments, but the level of noise that existed at the time that you were working on this report was nothing compared to the level of noise that happens on a story that's not even as significant. And I think that this is important because the Slavery and Justice Report isn't just a reflection of a university's will. This is also a conversation about leadership, the ability to stay the course, the ability to understand what a university does best, which is research and amplify the truth, and stick to that agenda in the light of a lot of criticism and pressure. Right now, we have, more than 100 universities that have engaged this question of slavery and its history. And in each context that this work is happening, the noise sounds a little bit different, but it is all in the service of, I think, undermining our best work as scholars. It's the noise of what if our history exposes the people in our community, in our state legislature, in our university leadership structure that have family ties to slavery? What if this alienates our donors? What if this contributes to an academic climate in which we start to get involved in these questions about, what's the real American history? And so I think in a sense, what I have observed in having been a student here and then being a faculty member at an institution that was part of that kind of second generation of slavery and justice reports, that there are certain components you have to have at a university in order for this to work. And it makes me appreciate how much Brown University had that. That's presidential leadership, the mandate from the top, excellent scholars, and then I think the third part is the financial capacity to actually animate the ideas. And so for those of you who are kind of new to this idea or think that every institution can do this, every institution cannot do this. Because this is about a kind of quality and persistence and commitment to justice that Ruth Simmons was able to have the fortitude and the grace to continue this work, that each university president after her who's looking at that, we hope they have those same components. And so I think in the reissue of this report, this isn't just about the archival work or the lecturers or the conversations like these. These are about these components of leadership that I think are critically important in our time if we are going to say that the university belongs to a lot of different people, both visible and invisible, every day on campus. And then the last thing I want to say about this report and the tremendous work of the folks 15 years ago, it's amazing to think of the way that this type of work changes our students. When we were at the very beginning of the work at Georgetown University, which really centered around some of the more common issues you see on a college campus, and that was the renaming of 2 residence halls. We had 2 residence halls that were named after Jesuit leaders who were engaged in the sale of at least 272 people in 1838 for the sake of the university. This could have gone the path of a lot of university debates. Do you change names? What does it mean to memorialize? What's the new name? We've seen those conversations before. But what I've seen over the course of 6 years is that our students have a new understanding of the incredible debts that are owed by virtue of being in the position to pursue a university education. That their debts are not just their student debts, and their debts are not just about their personal financial needs. They have a real clear sense of the debts that are owed by virtue of the experience. And I think that without this type of foundational work, our students are not able to have, I think, the wherewithal and the insight to imagine institutions as places in which complicated decisions in the past mean something for them in the present and for their future. And this changing relationship between students and the institution, I think, has been really helpful for all of us because it pushes accountability, not just for grappling with historical issues, but it also sets new questions about the university as a responsible actor, whether it's in issues of housing and gentrification, whether it's in the treatment of workers, whether it's in its investment portfolio and its relationship to climate change and mass incarceration. It pushes our students to think differently about how they participate in the life of the university beyond their major and the degree that they're going to get upon graduation. And I think any opportunity, especially as someone who teaches at an elite institution, I won't say if it's comparable to Brown, but we can have that conversation later, but a place where students work very hard to get in, and students are expected to do well in a number of ways, that we are able to present in front of them something as humbling and something as eye-opening and something as fundamentally transformative as the possibility that their education means something, that there is a debt that may not be paid in their lifetime, but we are still moved to try to repay it in some way.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor. Professor Rothman?
Well, it's an honor to be with you today as we mark a new edition of Brown's Slavery and Justice Report. And I'm very, very pleased to have a short essay in the volume entitled The Dialectics of Racism and Repair. And in a few minutes, I'll tell you a little bit about that essay. But first, I want to offer a few quick comments about my relationship to the self-study that President Simmons launched and that my former colleague Jim Campbell so ably shepherded to completion. I arrived at Brown in the fall of 2004, just as work was beginning on the Slavery and Justice Initiative. Untenured and new to campus, there actually wasn't a place for me on the steering committee, but there ended up being an opportunity that proved to be far more transformational to my own research and teaching. And that is, over 2 years, the academic year 2004-2005 and the academic year 2005-2006, Professor Campbell and I supervised several dozen of Brown's most talented undergraduates in a group research project that contributed a significant portion of the research that populates the Slavery and Justice Report. It ended up, our experience, ended up being a sort of testament to what happens when you turn an incredibly talented group of Brown undergraduates loose in the archive. And just do what you want, see what you can find, and sure enough, armed with questions that established scholars who were mired in the historiography of their fields had not even thought to ask, these undergraduates turned up so many amazing things, and it was such a pleasure to learn with and to learn from them over those 2 years. People like Rachel Bedard, who is currently a physician in New York City who works to redress the inadequacy of healthcare among geriatric prisoners on places like Rikers Island, and who was actually profiled in this coming weekend's New York Times. People like Wilfred Codrington and Sean Sipperstein, both of whom have essays in the volume that is being re-released today. Seth Magaziner, our current state treasurer. Brianna Larkin, a high school arts principal in Oakland. Rabbi Annie Lewis, a leading light of Reconstructionist Judaism. And Sage Morgan Hubbard, who many of you know here at Brown as the assistant director of our Center for Students of Color. 2 years of intense work with many challenging conversations shaped the texture of the final Slavery and Justice Report, but also very much drove my teaching in new directions, fostering first a course on slavery and capitalism in American economic development, and then a broader course on the 500-year history of capitalism that begins with the transatlantic slave trade as the force that shapes early modern global integration and that established the institutions and practices of property rights and commodification that endured long after slavery was abolished. That work also nurtured a 2011 conference at Brown and Harvard called Slavery's Capitalism that compiled the most recent scholarship on slavery's precise role in US economic development in the decades following the American Revolution. The book that resulted from that conference is, appropriately, dedicated to President Ruth Simmons, whose leadership in making space for a more truthful and honest reckoning with the American past continues to merit our gratitude. Of course, we convene today at a moment when there are pernicious forces operating to narrow the space for a more truthful and honest reckoning with the American past. As our new colleague Nolue Rooks observed in her convocation address a mere 2 months ago, there are legislative efforts across the country that call for, quote, shadows of darkness and erasure that intend to suppress or ban what Brown University has asked us to engage and grapple with. These dynamics of racial progress, countered by the inevitable backlash, really were at the heart of the essay that I contributed to the new edition of the Slavery and Justice Report, where I puzzled over the possibilities of historical change tied to the mere act, and I say mere advisedly, of telling the truth about history. Rereading the Slavery and Justice Report in 2021, I'm struck by its embeddedness in the expectation that a full, honest engagement with the American past would facilitate a better and different American future. This is a mode of history at the intersection of reckoning and healing, a faith that if we tell the truth about the past in all of its deromanticized, demystified complexity, warts and all, as the saying goes, we can move beyond trauma, shame, and denial to a world in which everyone can prosper and thrive. This would position historical truth-telling as a form of repair, first by ceasing to do any additional harm in the form of incomplete and misleading accounts of what had happened in the past, and then by providing a basis for a substantive transformation of society on the premise that the truth will set all of us, the descendants of survivors, of victims, of perpetrators, of beneficiaries, of bystanders, of witnesses, free. Confronting this at the present moment, though, I've begun to feel like this was perhaps unduly optimistic. Telling the truth about history is a necessary but not sufficient condition for structural transformation. Any anti-racist future that we desire requires it, but it alone cannot create that future. The last 15 years have borne witness to this in complicated ways, not in ways that diminish the Slavery and Justice Report or the spirit that brought it into being, but rather in ways that demand additional kinds of political work on all of our parts. Many things are different from the moment when the Slavery and Justice Report was issued in 2006, and we have witnessed a significant transformation of the symbolic landscape. Aunt Jemima ceases to smile from the packaging of pancake mixes, and statues of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson no longer greet visitors to Charlottesville. Yet on the other hand, we continue to witness the devaluation of Black life, ongoing police and now vigilante violence, well-documented environmental racism in places like Flint, a pandemic in which Black mortality rates have been disproportionately high. Clearly, symbolic sacrifices in the aisles of grocery stores are easier concessions to make than the dismantling of systemic racism. And it's at this moment then that we're left to confront the uncomfortable relationship between anti-Black violence and the remediation of the symbolic landscape. Why have Confederate monuments come down? Why have Uncle Ben and Rostis the Cream of Wheat Chef come off the boxes that grace supermarket aisles? It turns out it isn't because we've told the truth about the past. The precipitating events were shocking murders, not scholarly monographs. Reckonings, always incomplete, but reckonings followed Ferguson, followed Charleston, followed Minneapolis. Things happened after a police officer shot Michael Brown, after a white supremacist shot 9 worshipers at the Emmanuel African Methodist Church, after a police officer suffocated George Floyd on a city street. This is a dynamic we know from the life on American college campuses as well. Buildings are renamed after the false arrest of a student of color. A new diversity curriculum is unveiled after racist graffiti appears on a dorm wall. So unfortunately, we are summoned to recognize the entanglements of anti-Black violence and the subsequent efforts towards remediation, a dialectic of racist violence and anti-racist remediation that pulls us forward without necessarily offering any opportunity or assurance of obliterating the former and achieving the latter. Yet to the extent that we are caught in this nexus, I think we're also reminded of the power of common people acting in concert and in public space to wield the necessary pressure from below to push that process forward. And here I refer to the summer of 2020, when mass protests in response to state violence, when millions of Americans took to the streets to declare that Black Lives Matter, and then were met by a disproportionate force of armed police units, it was impossible to maintain the status quo. But millions of people engaged in civil disobedience, millions of people engaged in acts of solidarity with neighbors and strangers alike, millions of people engaged in speech acts, large and small, from Black high school students who led a Providence and peaceful protest to white families who put up Black Lives Matter signs in windows in their predominantly white neighborhoods. Revelations of righteousness rarely occur absent pressure from below, and none of this happened without the advocates of justice taking to the streets and demanding an end to police killings of Black Americans. These protests were powerful, although regrettably less effective in stopping police violence than in compelling corporations to change their brand logos and universities to rename dormitories. I don't mean to sound sour on the project of truth-telling, anything but that. But now, 16 months later, we convene amidst a backlash that now involves trying to ban Toni Morrison novels and getting worked up about something called critical race theory, deployed to counter what is honestly just a matter of telling the truth about history. We can never stop striving, to tell that history, and indeed the role of the university is to do just that. Our faculty president, Govind Menon, reminded the faculty of that at his inaugural comments this fall at the first faculty meeting. We, as members of a university community, have a responsibility to pursue the truth and to disseminate it amidst a world that might not be willing to hear it. But at the end of the day, and this is my reflection on where sort of slavery and justice is 15 years later as a member of this community, as a member of last year's task force on anti-Black racism, it simply occurs to me that we must put our commitments to truth-telling alongside other modes of political participation that have proven most effective in effecting social change, the politics of protest, the politics of community, the politics of solidarity, that will inevitably, I hope, bring every American of every background closer to pursuing the very possibility of the interracial democracy that we all hope to live under in the future. Thank you.
Jim? When I woke up this morning, I honestly had no idea what I was going to say, and I don't know whether I'll be able to read what I scribbled sitting at my breakfast table. I actually wasn't worried about that. Since the release of the report of the Slavery and Justice Committee 15 years ago, and indeed, since the public announcement of the committee's existence 3 years before that, I've given more talks, written more essays and reflections on this committee and its work than I can count. So I just figured I would lash a few tidbits of that together, and 10 minutes would go by in the blink of an eye. Two things happened this morning that changed me. The first was having a song pop up on my playlist that I hadn't heard in a very long time. I won't try to sing it for you, but the chorus says, "We are each other's angels and we show each other's signs." The second was an email awaiting me when I woke up from Seth, including a profile that is in today's New York Times online, will be in this weekend, with a former student of ours, one of the students in the group research project, one of the students who conducted research for the Slavery and Justice Committee. Her name is Rachel Bedard. Rachel, I discovered, is the director of geriatric and complex care services in the New York City jail system. It's a new office, an office she herself effectively created. In fact, according to the article, she is the only jail-based geriatrician in the country, who knows, maybe in the world. I commend the article to your attention. I bring it up here because it illustrated for me two of the central questions with which the Slavery and Justice Committee grappled during its tenure. First, what are slavery's legacies? What did the institution leave us? What did it do to us? And second, what are we to do about that? The profile I read today of Rachel provides possible answers to both of those questions. It also reminds us, as this morning's song reminded me, that we are surrounded by angels and signs. We have but to open our eyes and our minds and our hearts to see them. Many of the most gracious things that have ever happened to me in my life happened because of the work of this committee. I would include my friendship with the three people who share the stage with me, who I esteem as highly as I do anyone in the profession. I wouldn't call it a relationship because I'm too frightened of her for that, but I would include the fact that I have been able to spend time in the presence of Ruth Simmons, who is an angel in my life. I would add dozens of other friendships and relationships that blossomed as a result of this experience, including with many people who served or contributed to the committee. Many of you are sitting in this hall today, and thank you. But I'm thinking about more than that. My current research project, which studies the history and memory of a series of violent crimes committed during the death throes of Mississippi Jim Crow, began with a trip I took to Mississippi in 2004 with members of the group research project. I'm thinking also today of one of the speakers who we brought here to talk to us, and through that relationship, I was able to travel to West Africa, to Sierra Leone, to accompany a woman who was the great, 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 great grandchild of a little 10-year-old girl named Priscilla, who was born to New World slavery on a North American slave ship, a Rhode Island slave ship, a Providence slave ship, a slave ship owned by a member of the Brown Corporation. The goal of Priscilla's homecoming, as it was called, was to bring her ancestral spirit home, and perhaps in the process to do something to help repair a grievously wounded land. I was able to attend a ceremony reconsecrating, or I should say perhaps simply consecrating, a cemetery at the University of Virginia, where for the better part of a century, the bodies of enslaved workers at the university were unceremoniously deposited, symbolically outside the walls of the regular university cemetery. That event was sponsored by the University of Virginia's Presidential Committee on the University and Slavery, an initiative directly inspired by the work done here at Brown. I was able to have an extraordinary conversation with a woman in Seattle who I have still never met. A conversation provoked by a very angry email that she sent to the committee, telling us, in effect, to get stuffed. That the past was the past, that bad things happened, that the world was full of pain, and that we should stop whining and move on. I wrote her back. I had a policy that I wrote back to every single person who sent an email to the committee, a personal email. The only ones I exempted were people whose email included a word beginning with F or a word beginning with N. She didn't, so I replied. And I said that thanked her for the note. I found it interesting. I'd be very happy to talk with her more about what we were doing if she was interested. To my surprise, she took me up on the offer. In the course of a several hours long conversation, I realized that she was a child of the Magdalene Laundries. Now, I don't know if that will mean anything to you, but for a century, right through the latter years of the 20th century, girls in Ireland who became pregnant out of wedlock were taken from their homes by the Catholic Church and set to work in church-owned laundries, at the end of which they were buried in mass unmarked graves. Their babies were taken from them and put up for adoption, often by childless Catholic families in the United States. This woman was one of them. She had only discovered this as an adult. She had not known she was adopted. And she somehow had managed to track down her mother in Ireland, who was still alive, but discovered that, in fact, her mother was not particularly interested in pursuing the relationship and felt that nothing had happened to her that she didn't herself deserve. In the course of that conversation, I realized that when this woman was saying, "Move on, get on with it," she didn't really believe it herself. On that day, I got to be someone else's angel, or at least someone else's sign. We cannot change the past. We cannot undo history, but we can face it. We can face the truth of what happened here on our campus, in our state, in our nation, and in the world. We can take ownership and responsibility for all of it, not only for the gracious, but also for the grievous, not only for the honorable, but also for the horrifying. And in the process, perhaps, we can also alter the matrix of political possibility in the present. We can help ourselves to understand why the world we live in looks as it does, and what responsibilities we inherit in light of that fact. I'm not talking here about pointing an accusatory finger at people in the past while ostentatiously patting ourselves on the back for our own superior wisdom. I am not talking about draping oneself in the garb of self-righteousness and sanctimony, though I fear that is often the way in which people in our society today respond when the subject of historical injustice arises. Rather, I'm talking about owning who we are and talking together about what we might do to heal. That is some of what I learned through my involvement with the Slavery and Justice Committee. And that's what I wanted to share with you today.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much, all three panelists. Can I ask a question to all three of you? Picking up from from Professor Rockman's presentation, to ask whether or not the issues of protests and struggle, particularly from what some of us will call from below, whether or not actually there is not that struggle is not also around the question of whose history. And that there's struggle around whose history, then doesn't the business of historical truth-telling, the phrase that we have been using, isn't it part of the overall, if you want to call it, movement towards something that is better, to a future that's different? And how can we think about historical truth-telling in relationship to the various struggles, practical struggles, the movements that actually exist? That's what, because one of the things I'm always struck with is that in trying to think about particularly Black struggles, that Black struggles are always involved with also history. There's no Black struggle anywhere from Africa to United States, anywhere in the Americas, that does not have a component of it that spends time thinking about history. So I want to put that on the table. Any one of you. I don't want to put you in this.
No, I'm happy to talk about comments that I could understand as being perceived as sort of a buzzkill in regard to the spirit of today. But I want to draw attention to sort of necessary but not sufficient as the key sort of direction that I'm going with this. Of course, it's essential. Of course, it is present for any social justice movement to tell the truth, to reclaim the historical narrative, and to upturn or upend the dominant narratives that, as we know, have long been geared towards skewing historical accounts, excusing historical injustices, and dismissing the experiences of people who've long been marginalized from the institutions that are custodians of our collective history. This is absolutely indisputable. The fact of the matter, though, as I also think about this, Tony, is that so much of when we're talking about history, terms like we didn't see, we didn't recognize, should always, of course, set off our alarms. And this is something that I have certainly learned in my engagement with the scholarship coming out of Africana studies or Black studies more generally, is that we should pause on that we and figure out who that we is, as we've never thought about slavery and capitalism. Oh, we have, right? We've never thought about, yeah, we have. And I think it's urgent for scholars, no matter where they are situated within the matrix of social difference within our society, whatever the subjectivities they carry, to think about the work that the we does, what kind of collectives it summons into existence, and what kind of exclusions it reproduces. But I think the spirit of your comment, though, is an important one, and it's an important one for everyone in this room to think about the way in which the scholarship has moved over the last 15 years. One of the questions when we taught the Slavery and Justice Report as first readings this year that we asked is, how might it look different if this were being written in 2021? What kind of new vocabulary, for example, might be there? And so when we think about the ways in which, Black studies or Black feminist scholarship has alerted us to thinking in terms of the afterlives of slavery, when we've thought about the sort of moves that scholars like Saidiya Hartman have made to re-narrate in ways that decenter the archival certainties of Western empiricism, these are moments of creating a new vocabulary that so many of our students have and that we are now thinking with. And I do wonder if a 2021 Slavery and Justice Report might in fact have a different vocabulary. I mean, I don't know, Jim, does the term structural racism show up?
No.
No, the term systematic racism, I don't think that vocabulary is there. And it's a remarkable thing to ponder how that vocabulary has become commonplace in the kind of analytic work that it does. And this is a testament to new scholars and new scholarship finally gaining and maintaining a foothold within these academic institutions.
Good. Wow.
I think that's an excellent point, and I think that this question of what does a Slavery and Justice Report look like in 2021, I think it's thinking about what Jim was gesturing to of slavery as an origin story for a number of ways in which to look at the university. I think, Craig Wilder's book, Ebony and Ivy, does such a good job in helping us understand, I think this used to be a conversation about monuments and the names on buildings. And then this was a conversation about capital. And I think now this conversation is about this issue of structure and form that may not articulate itself in the exclusion of Black students or in segregated housing, but in practices of the university that are also that are also interlocked into systems of racial and ethnic discrimination or inequality. And so I think that, you know, people like Davarian Baldwin, who just came out with a new book called Universities, where he talks about the building of hospitals in Chicago and Hyde Park, when he talks about you know, campuses and policing. I think that the through line gets longer and longer because not only the scholarship, but I think to your point, Seth, like, this is the type of project that opens up the possibility for a center for the study of slavery, that opens up the possibility that postdocs who are not just looking at the 19th and the 18th century, but are looking at kind of those questions. And so I guess the thing that is difficult about all of this is that without this type of move, then we don't even have the platforms or the possibilities for new scholars, right? Like, this is what it takes to get 5 more people to ask more thoughtful questions. And I think that indicts the university in different ways.
Great. Jim?
You know, I guess it sort of amplifies or just extends sort of what's been said. You know, so one of the things I'm working on now is everyone's heard of it. You've heard multiple versions of the story, the murder of 3 civil rights workers in Philadelphia, Mississippi in the summer of 1964. And one thing that's been very clear to me as I've been trying to actually gain insight into the thinking of the people who perpetrated the crime is they all had a story about Reconstruction in their head. They had seen this before. They had seen a previous attempt on the part of northern racial fanatics during Reconstruction to grind a proud but prostrate white South under the boot heel of Negro domination by extending political rights to a race of people who were inferior and upsetting a social and racial order that they didn't understand. And they did exactly what the heroic forebears of their textbooks had done, was they drove the usurpers away. That's how they understood what they were doing. And what I take about that is that whether we like it or not, you know, we make politics in the present based on assumptions and ideas about the past. Indeed, I think every political claim that everyone ever makes about the present rests in some fashion on a set of political claims about the past, and vice versa. And so my thought in this, as we got going on this, was, you know, that what we were doing was changing, if we could change the ways in which people understood the past, why the world looked as it does, that we were altering, as I think I use this phrase here, the matrix of political possibility in the present. But as Seth says, it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. If people have bad historical understandings, they are going to make bad politics in the present, right? Giving them better understandings doesn't necessarily mean that they make better politics. Remember in geometry, I used to teach geometry, where you could have a proposition, it didn't mean the inverse and the converse were true, but the contrapositive was, right? If you have bad history, you will have bad politics, right? And so the process, it's just the geometry teacher's version of necessary but not sufficient. And so the point is simply that there still is political work to be done. But that political work can be done better, more persuasively, if it is done on a more inclusive and more honest accounting of the past. If you can, I mean, Michael Ignatieff has a phrase I quote all the time about truth commissions that's pertinent here. You know, you can't lead people to the truth, but you can narrow the range of permissible lies. And in the process of doing that, you can also perhaps alter the matrix of political possibility.
Okay, great, thanks. Can I ask, turn it over to the audience? Anybody has, if you raise your hand. Yeah, and then we have folks who are walking around with mics because we're recording this. Here, I see a hand here. Just first, and then, is there another hand?
Having not read the second report, I'd like to propose the third report. Less than 2 miles from here, 550 children, mostly of color, attended a school today. They attended at the Isaac Hopkins School. And we know from the work that was done by you previously that there were 109 who died on the Middle Passage. There was another group sold in Antigua at the slave market, but as payment to the sailors and to the sponsors of the voyage, there were a group of slaves who came here to Providence. And it is entirely possible that some of the children in that school today are direct descendants, as you did with great Priscilla. And I wore a tie today that Ruth Simmons gave to me because I wear bow ties, and I was on her civic council, and she gave out long brown ties. And I used to enjoy taunting her. And I taunted her into giving me this tie. And what I used to taunt her about, too, was the conversion of the great liberal arts university in America into a very technological university. And for the third report, what I would propose is that there be on this stage members of the biotech community at Brown who have worked to trace the DNA of those 86 who did survive the voyage of the Sally. Because what we have seen is that when we can identify and tie, as in the case of Georgetown, when a specific group, or in the case of the Hemmings family, when DNA can go back and tie together that the follow the money, and I like yours, Professor, because I've read your work and it's great, but that combination of following the money and following the DNA gives us an actual group of people who are much more likely to be compensated for
I want to
this.
say something quick about this.
And none of this existed 15 years ago. But it exists now, and it will be very interesting to see how the melding of the biotechnological, the DNA evidence, along with other evidence, ship's logs, following the money, what that will produce in the third report.
So I'll say something very quick and then kick it to Marcia, because Marcia's working with at a university which is dealing with precisely this fact. It was not done through DNA testing, it was done through the good Jesuit record keeping, that it was possible to trace living descendants of the 272 people that the university sold to save itself financially in 1838, all of whom, in fact, were sold to Louisiana. And I think, without wanting to anticipate what Marcia's going to say, having a different set of stakeholders complicates the politics immensely, because different stakeholders have different points of view. What I'll say about it is this, and it's something that I felt a great deal when I was on this trip with a woman, her name, she's a school teacher in South Carolina named Tomlin Martin Polite, who was Priscilla's 5 times great-granddaughter. And I was in awe of her. You know, I mean, I felt the sense of intimacy and connection that I had to this history was so palpable. And then I thought, you know, what the hell are you thinking? Every single black person that you know in this country, unless their ancestors migrated here after 1965, when we finally began to open the doors of naturalization to people who were not white, every one of them has ancestors who that's how they got here, right? It's not like, oh, we found one. It's like we found 40 million. And so for me, the DNA, the direct connection, somehow makes it incredibly more powerful and compelling to people, right? And yet, I don't think it should make any difference at all. We know. And you don't have to bring me your genome for me to know how you got here, something of the history that you carry, and something of the obligation that we all inherit in light of that.
You know, having lived in this place for about 6 years institutionally, I think you raised some interesting questions about, I think I hear two things in your comments. One, which members of the university community are on deck for this question, right? Is it just all the people in the history department, you make them go to a library with some students and it's done, but how do we involve all of the actors in the university in ethical grappling with slaveholding? So I hear that, and I think it's important. You know, the thing that was most profound for me, having the opportunity to meet the group broadly defined as the descendants, to Jim's point, is that for each descendant you meet, there's a different idea of what fair is. But I think the thing that was so dangerous in those conversations about what Georgetown owes the descendants is that the majority of the ideas rested in things like university admission. And I felt like that was such an insult to the entire experience, that the great tragedy of slavery is that people didn't get to go to Georgetown. I mean, I found it particularly insulting and ridiculous when we would say, well, it should be scholarships to the university, as in Monday in 2017. And 100 members of the descendant community came, and the head of the Jesuits issued an apology for slavery, things that I never thought I would see in my lifetime: a Black president, a Jesuit pope, and the Catholic Church acknowledging slavery and apologizing. Sorry, for the other Catholics in the room, you get that. But all of this is to say that one of the visitors pulled me aside and he said, you know, this process has been frustrating, it's been degrading, everyone is on the news, you know, I felt very lost. And he said, all I really wanted was to celebrate Mass with the Jesuits. And it took us 2 years to get to the point where we just wanted to celebrate Mass. And I think for me, it was like a gut punch, because I had a very sophisticated and right way of thinking what was fair, and direct cash payments and reparations should look like this. But within this context of the community of faith, they just wanted to celebrate Mass. That was the entry point. And I think this is when, you know, the world of the university starts to really believe itself a little too much, that we can determine what justice feels and looks like for communities that are harmed. So that's what I'll say about that. Thoughts and prayers to this institution if you want to go down that road.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, I see two. One at the back and then the gentleman right there. Let's do the gentleman at the back first, please.
Hi, my name is Jody Rich. I'm on the faculty here in the medical school, the public health school. And a lot of people are kind of scratching their head, what does that mean? And I think Exhibit A is our criminal justice system with mass incarceration. And I'm wondering if you, when you're thinking about reparations or changes that should be made, given the stark racial disparities in our criminal justice system, if any thought in this current report is given to addressing that somehow.
Tony, that's for you.
Yeah, that's a question I've been getting for the last week from various journalists. And also the question, allied to that is the question that why didn't you all write about reparations and advocate reparations in the report? And this is my response. The question of reparations today cannot be off the table. But the kind of reparations that one is talking about, it's got to be a reparations in which you discuss this with the communities. You can't sit down at University Hall or elsewhere and say, okay, this is the kind of reparations that we are going to make. What Marsha just said to me is really important, because that's a form of repair that person was asking about, and saying, this is what I really wanted. And so for me, the reparations debate is an important one, is a necessary one in a country where you have these kind of historical injustices. But it also has two dimensions to it. It has a dimension that has to do with racial slavery and its history and consequences, but it also has to do with indigenous peoples in the Northeast. And you can't then decide to do one and don't do the other. And so that for me, therefore, any discussion of reparations and I know Brown students last year or last semester demanded that, it really requires a community a conversation internally, but also requires, more important for me, a conversation outside of the university. We are in a community. We sit on a certain kind of land, of indigenous people lands. The racial slavery helped to build the university. We want to then talk about, okay, how do we deal with that fact of where we are, and what kind of things can we make? What kind of repair can we do in relationship to the community, and communities that are here and in which we surround us, in which we are embedded. So that's my response. It's the other thing I would say, and here I speak to as a center director, is that we at the center have had debates on reparations, and have welcomed all the various views about all the national views, from people who are arguing that you have to make sure that you are American, you're born in America or have some relationship to America to get reparations and so on, to views in which says that the reparation should only be around questions of housing, a kind of model that happened at Evanston in Illinois. So we have had all those views been debated. Whether or not the university should take a national position on it, to me, is something that is up for debate, but particularly I think important is for the university to think about its particular location and its relationship to itself and to the community as an institute of higher education. That's how I see it. Sorry.
So one of the remarkable things, and first let me say, Dr. Rich, thank you for the work that you do in our community, and I want to acknowledge that here, is of course that we don't have a Center for the Study of Slavery. We have a Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. And it's the and justice that is crucially and distinctively what we do here at Brown. And to look at the programming of the center, to look at the intellectual and political projects that scholars have organized through the center, they take on questions of mass incarceration. They take on questions of human trafficking. They take on medical inequalities and medical racism. There are so many different kinds of initiatives that are taking place under the umbrella of the center that Tony runs, that there's no question to me that we have the capacity to intervene on these crucial issues of public policy. And I think the center moving forward in the next phases of its life, as it comes to have closer ties to the Watson Institute in Public Policy, as it comes to have closer ties to Brown's Medical School, as it comes to have closer ties to other initiatives on campus, it's really my hope that the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice can translate what we know about the past, about slavery, into a program for meaningful social change.
Yeah, look, I think that the Slavery and Justice Report speaks extensively about incarceration as one of the primary institutional and ideological legacies of slavery. And one of the central intellectual and intervention projects of the Center for Slavery and Justice has been around incarceration. So I mean, I agree with you completely about this, and that was also part of what I was trying to signal today in invoking Rachel Bedard, who's working with geriatric patients on Rikers Island. But you know what, and Tony and I have had this conversation in different ways over many years, but you know, the term reparation is a root from the word repair. It is a form of repair. And there are many forms of repair that can be profoundly meaningful. If I have hurt you, and I say, God, I really hurt you, here's $10, I would probably affront you. An apology, and we have quite sophisticated apparatus for interpreting apologies, can be a profoundly important form of repair, as if you know that if you've ever been denied one you thought you deserved, right? A memorial can be an apology. Creating a center, or can be, a form of repair. Creating a center that directs the resources of the university to legacies of slavery and to forms of repair and to forms of justice is a form of repair. I think, part of what we tried to do in the report was open this conversation up to a variety of modalities of thinking about this and to draw on, there's an entire chapter of that report about the history. I think it's the single best short thing you can read, frankly, about the history of the reparations for slavery issue in American history that covers 200 years in a variety of iterations of this movement. But there's also a chapter of that report that is about international modalities of repair more globally, from truth commissions to retrospective prosecutions to monetary reparations programs to institutional and national apologies and so forth. And part of what we were trying to do was blow open that conversation, because I think at the time, and maybe again today, we have been locked in as a nation into a fairly, I think, unprofitable and narrow conversation about who owes money to whom. And I worry about that, honestly. I'm not trying to prejudge the legitimacy of monetary reparations projects in different contexts, but effectively defining this as a tort and the form of redress being monetary creates a variety of problems, starting, as Tony's already invoked, with who's responsible to pay, who is an appropriate recipient. And, the Brown family, one of the things I will confess, because of the Sally and because we had 200 manuscript pages of a particularly horrific slaving voyage in our archives, we turned the Brown family into a kind of poster child for the Rhode Island slave trade. And I don't have a brief for the Brown family, but in some ways that was very deceptive. The Brown brothers were involved in 2 voyages, John then in another 3. There are other merchants in Rhode Island, including others who were on the College of Rhode Island Corporation, who were involved in 1520 and more. But the reason I bring this up is the two voyages that the Brown brothers sent, they lost their shirts. As Bob mentioned, 109 of the 186 enslaved people that Isaac Hopkins purchased on the coast of West Africa on behalf of the Brown brothers died before they could be sold. And most of those who survived and were sold in Antigua were so beleaguered that they were paid 4 and 5 pounds apiece for. The other voyage that they sent in 1759, the Wheel of Fortune, was taken by a privateer, French privateer, so they lost everything. So what do you do if this is something that we're going to try to assess monetarily? Oh, the Brown brothers, if they'd been better at it and made a lot of money out of it, then they're responsible. Or we have no financial obligation because we made no money. Now, I'm being only partly facetious here. These are the kinds of questions that when we define this in terms of monetary damages, that become inescapable. And I worry that they then narrow the ground in which we can dialogue and reflect and act to repair this damage.
Yeah, this is why I just want to say again that for us at the center, the question of reparations cannot be shut down, but it has to be enlarged and it has to be a major debate, not just at Brown, but between Brown and the community.
I was more thinking about, more than reparations, just...
Oh, sorry.
We still have legalized, constitutionally legalized slavery in our correctional system in this country now. That fixing that justice system, it addresses your second question, what do we do about it?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we agree. I agree and said, as a spokesperson for the center, say what it is that we're doing. But I also think it is very important that we think very critically about what we are saying, that whether or not the carceral state is a legal system of slavery, what does that mean in the 21st century, and how does that relate to this question of racial slavery and how racial slavery was a unique phenomenon that created the modern world. And so, I don't want to have a debate about it now, but I would want to suggest that for us, not because we're scholars, but also quite frankly because of politics, one has to be very careful about the language that one uses. And I understand carceral state has legalized slavery, but it is not quite the slavery of the plantations that made the modern world, so on. So I would, let's have, you be the last question, sir.
Yes, and I'll be very brief. We've been talking about the need to be grounded in truth. and there's no one in this room who would disagree with that. But we also have an epistemological crisis, an epistemological divide. My worry, I'm a retired clergy person, my worry is that next year's midterm election is going to hinge on a big push for the maintenance of the notion of the virtuous republic. Yeah. We see this in so many iterations in these school board fights, but it's clear that the playbook of the party that imagines it's out of power for a minute is going to come surging back with massive untruths, and on top of that, universities are going to be horribly demonized. Studies of this kind are going to be horribly demonized because in the struggle for power, truth falls by the wayside. I don't know if you can respond to that, but it terrifies me.
Yeah, I think if I could respond quickly, we are in what some people have called a post-truth era. And that's very clear, which is why I think the business of truth-telling, particularly historical truth-telling, is really so important. The way in which the media carries the set of things these days is that we're in the middle of a culture war. We're not just in the middle of a cultural war. We're in the middle of an ideological struggle about white supremacy, about the foundations of this country. And the culture war becomes a kind of euphemistic way of hiding what is happening. The mobilization on in school districts against critical theory around Toni Morrison is not just about history. It's about making sure that there's a certain kind of republic that people understand, making sure that we have a certain kind of narrative about ourselves, about what is the American idea. So it's really part of a real push, I think, an ideological push that some folks are involved in, and that are really fighting to the death because the symbolic world, in my view, of who we are and what we are undergirds so much what is called the American idea, and of who and what we are. That if you win that battle, then you are, the other battles are fairly easy after that. So thanks for that. And one of the things that we try to do at the center, because of that recognition, is that for us the question of history is not now just what Seth and Marsha or Jim and myself, as a kind of latecomer historian, may write. But what is important is that the ways in which museums, the ways in which what we call public humanities and public history, the ways in which we can have an intervention in those domains becomes really critical for a survival, not just of historical truth, but quite frankly, for there to be an alternative understanding, for the survival of the alternative understanding of this nation and what has constituted this nation and how we were formed. Right?
I agree. I think that universities are highly embattled. I think they've been for a long time. One of the things I remember Ruth saying to me, it's 20 years ago, she said, one of the fundamental failures of university leadership in the United States is our failure to communicate clearly to a wider public what we do and why it matters, and the immense public good that we do and the importance of that. And in the absence of that, we have allowed universities to become caricatured as these fatuous little places that, are off doing their thing and feathering their own nests and saying these outlandish things and indoctrinating, young people and all of this sort of stuff. And I think Ruth understood. Part of, for me, and I don't want to speak for her, right? But what I think, if you read the stuff she wrote at the time and you read an essay, a really wonderful essay, there's a book of which I'm one of the co-editors called Slavery in the University, which has an essay by Ruth in it. For her, this was not simply about a kind of process of racial reckoning. This whole initiative was about asserting and defending what a university is and communicating that to our students and to a wider public. And I think that and why universities matter, and that universities, she said it today, are places where we can take the most vexed issues that confront our society and talk about them in a reasonable, orderly way and move those debates forward, right? And that was, I think in some ways, the driving force of this entire enterprise, I think the woman who appointed this committee had a profound faith in the idea of a university. And the fact that I heard her say this once, that she sat in an office beneath a portrait of the first president of Brown who came here to Providence with a slave in tow, said something to her not simply about the darkness of our history, but about the capacity of universities to outgrow the expectations of their founders if they hew to the values that they profess. And so I get mad sometimes at my students here when I was here and now at Stanford because they are ready to burn University Hall down. And I always want to say to them, look, I'll share whatever critiques of universities you have, but these institutions are flickering candles in a very dark world.
Okay, thank you very much, James. I just want to close this panel by thanking all of you and for your remarks, and to also thank the audience for their questions. I'm reminded as I close this panel of a conference on African American history which happened in 2013, of which you are a blogger, James. And it was about the study of paradigms for African American history. And the fierce arguments and debates at that conference was whether or not the paradigm of slavery to freedom, taken from the remarkable scholar, African-American scholar John Hope Franklin's book, was still, in fact, the paradigm from which we should study African-American history, and therefore also study American history. And I don't think that it was ever resolved, and I saw that from the blog, as the blogger, that was a sign. And therefore, as I was thinking about the Slavery and Justice Report and reflecting on that conference in 2013, I wondered if we shouldn't begin to think about African American history and paradigm is a problematic word, but let's use it for the moment, is instead of from slavery to freedom, really slavery to repair. And to think about repair as not about fixing what is broken, but rather repair as change. Rather repair as thinking about the conditions, the structures which perpetuate the legacies of historical injustice. I think this is where the Slavery and Justice Report takes us today. That there are differences today, different languages that people would use 15 years. Hopefully, yes, there would be. If they didn't, then I would get very worried as to where we are. But what the Slavery and Justice Report does is that it lays this ground. It lays this ground, as I said, that we can walk through. And that where we are now is from really thinking about slavery and repair. Slavery to repair, but repair is about transformation of the society in which we live in, so that we can all live in a different democracy that we all say we want. Or in fact, in a different kind of future that we say we all want to live in. And with those words, I want to close the panel and thank you all very, very much. And then I want to call upon Alison Levy to come to the podium to begin to talk about the digital. Alison Levy is the digital editor of our digital public humanities at the library. She was a co-editor with myself and Kaz, who was sitting, of the second edition of the report. So, Alison, please.
Thank you, Professor Bogues. I'm delighted to introduce the revised and expanded digital edition of Brown's landmark Slavery and Justice Report. The striking image before you juxtaposes Martin Purrier's Slavery Memorial, installed on the front green in 2014, against University Hall, constructed with enslaved labor in the late 18th century. This compelling re-foregrounding extends well beyond the virtual book cover. Indeed, the digital second edition represents Brown's commitment to constant evolution by offering readers an innovative, intentional, and inclusive experience. As an open access publication, it provides enduring, barrier-free access to knowledge. In other words, it is available to anyone, anywhere, for free. The application of universal design principles ensures equitable use by all persons, including those with disabilities. And further reflecting our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, the display typeface chosen for the digital edition was designed by a type foundry for creatives of color. The second edition opens with a foreword by President Paxson, addressing a new and expanded readership and providing the necessary framing for the representation of the report. In terms of content and organization, the report is positioned as both a scholarly one and a major historical document in its own right, complemented with the important story of how it came into being and how it transformed higher education's engagement with legacies of inequity and injustice. That interpretive narrative is told over 14 newly commissioned essays, which unfold in the column at the left. From this interactive table of contents, readers can navigate the book in any order of their choosing. The second edition acknowledges the work of Africans and African Americans who helped build Brown University and this nation. The dedication also recognizes the scholars and educators who confront history and effect change every day. The creation of the second edition was a deeply collaborative project, and all who contributed are acknowledged here as well. So let me now bring you into the book, beginning with the report. And again, with the possibility of navigating the resource in a non-linear fashion. I've selected this section, Slavery, the Slave Trade, and Brown University, to demonstrate the ways in which the digital second edition promotes deeper engagement with the historical documents contained in the original report. High-resolution, zoomable images allow readers to see details of 18th century documents that are often rendered illegible in print publications. I turn now from a view of the articles from the slave ship Sally, or the list of men who served on the ship in 1764, to this, the ship's manifest on its departure for Africa. The document includes the name of the ship's captain, Esek Hopkins, its owner, Nicholas Brown and Company, and a brief description of the ship's cargo. Readers of the digital edition can access full transcriptions of the historical documents, produced specifically for the second edition, and for use by digital humanities practitioners wishing to apply interpretive tools to the historical record. And now let me showcase a few of the essays, beginning with an interview of President Emerita Ruth Simmons by Professor Anthony Bogues. You'll find here thoughtful, inspiring remarks from Dr. Simmons about her motivations in calling for an investigation into the university's relationship to slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, the significance of the process that undergirded the investigation, and the enduring legacy of the report. A collective exploration of our history by Dean Zia introduces a set of short essays by alumni spanning a period of more than half a century at Brown. These reflections illustrate how the collective exploration of the university's history can be an act of both personal learning and public transformation. And let me here point out a second navigation system. For those readers who wish to read sequentially, relevant links are provided at the end of each essay. The final essay I'll spotlight today by Provost Visiting Professor Renee Ader allows me to say a few words about the library's commitment to digital preservation. Pop-up notes include URLs that have been archived to ensure permanent, reliable, unalterable links to the online sources cited throughout the book. This practice, among others, ensures prolonged access to the profound scholarship that comprises the second edition. I invite you all to explore the digital edition on your own, to revisit or read for the first time, perhaps, Brown's Slavery and Justice Report, to immerse yourself in the accompanying historical documents, and to learn from the contributors, past and present scholars at Brown, current and former university leaders, alumni, and recent graduates, all of whom have so generously contributed their expertise and insight to this remarkable second edition. Thank you. I would now like to welcome to the stage Brown University student Kevin Boyce Jr. Kevin is a recent graduate of the class of 2021 and is now a Brown graduate student completing the Master's in Public Affairs. Amongst other initiatives, he was a member of President Paxson's 2020 Anti-Black Racism Task Force. Please give a warm welcome to Kevin.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, President Paxson, for inviting me to speak here today. I would like to ask us to reflect on the following question. What does Brown University mean to you? As a Black student here, this is a question that I reflect on every day. Brown represents and stands for so much in the eyes of many Black students. On one hand, it represents hope. It represents opportunity. It represents a chance for some of our wildest dreams to come true. To become a doctor, a lawyer, an advocate for the communities that we've come from. For many of us, the significance of a Brown acceptance letter and the moment that we received it just cannot be understated. But on another hand, Brown also represents pain and grief. Brown University, this very campus that we stand on today, was built on the lands of Native peoples, and its buildings were erected on the backs of the labor of enslaved Africans. For generations, faces that looked like mine were not welcomed here, nor were we welcomed into society as a whole. Our stories were casted to the shadows of history as we were treated like less than human. In many ways, Brown, like most other higher education institutions, was complicit with this treatment. And as I walk around the main green, and I look at the historic buildings that were built by my ancestors, I reflect on the opportunity that has been granted to me to be here at this school at a time such as this. And I'm quite often humbled by both the feelings of grief and hope. So, what does Brown University mean to me? Well, when I think about Brown, I think about the phrase, ever true. Ever true to Brown is the motto you hear when you first visit campus. It echoes through the auditorium and sails and cascades across the main green and through the Van Wickle gates at convocation and commencement. But being ever true to Brown is bigger than just the standard fanfare of an illustrious institution. No, being ever true to Brown displays to Brunonia and to the world what Brown truly stands for. What I realized was that in many ways, ever true to Brown is an incomplete sentence. What we mean when we use it is that we are ever true to the values that we believe make Brown, Brown. It represents our collective commitment to these values and is our mutual pact to uphold them together. These values transcend any gate, any building, or any campus that we could have been placed on. Rather, they represent the ideals that make Brunonians ever true to an institution that was special enough to choose to take all of us in the first place. Being ever true to Brown stands for many things, but above all, it stands for moral courage. The courage to consistently stand up for each other and for what is right, even when no one is standing with us. It stands for holding Brown's current and future leaders' feet to the fire in order to promote equity, inclusion, and diversity, above other things. And it stands for holding these community leaders accountable for what they say they stand for. We hold ourselves to a high standard here, and rightfully so. I mean, in 2020, not only were we in the midst of an unprecedented pandemic, but we were also bearing witness to a civil rights movement that was finally boiling over. Students from all ethnicities and races marched in the name of Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd, among others, and Black students, in particular Black women, led with strength, courage, and perseverance, planning and participating in these demonstrations across our country, working with leaders to create policy and action plans in our communities, just like Brown, in order to enthusiastically and definitively declare that Black lives matter. And that brings us to today, and to the significance of this moment to Black students on our campus. In a moment in which Black people are especially vulnerable to pain and strife, we as Brunonians are continuing to work towards upholding our values and making our campus as inclusive and as welcoming as possible. And it starts by acknowledging our past. 15 years ago, Brown President Ruth Simmons set out to do just that with the original creation of the Slavery and Justice Report. Simmons set out to answer the simple question of what was Brown's relation to the transatlantic slave trade. And she became confused when she couldn't find the answers that she sought. Simmons understood that there weren't any answers because answering questions like this is, frankly, an incredibly difficult task. It requires much introspection, and managing the weight of previous generational harms that we as a community have inflicted is just hard. But what Simmons also understood, and what this report represents to me, is that despite how hard it may be, Brown must always continue to do the work to simply be better. We must not shy away from our most unfortunate truths, and must continue to advocate for marginalized people and communities, even if at times it means having tough and uncomfortable conversations about our own role in causing harm. We have an obligation as an institution to continue to ask ourselves the hard questions and to delve deeper into our own history in order to better understand our role in correcting the past and better preparing for our future. In the words of President Simmons herself, she said, "We must not hide from that fact, for it is a part of our past, and in speaking its truth, we not only let the light in, but we give it air, making it shine more brightly." This ability to hold ourselves accountable is truly what caused many students like myself to choose Brown in the first place. Brown is not perfect, not by any means, but it stood out amongst its peers as an institution that was the best at working towards understanding its role in undoing harm. What this report represents to me and many others is that it is the start of our efforts to repair and rebuild what oftentimes people in our positions have torn down. So, when we think about the question, what does Brown mean to us? Let us be reminded of what makes Brown so special in the first place. It's not just a beautiful campus, and it's certainly not just an open curriculum, but it's the inherent desire of its community to do good. That's what sets us apart. And that is why I'll always love Brown. So let's be ever true to principle, to courage, to knowledge, and most importantly, be ever true to the everlasting pursuit to perfect what it means to be ever true to Brown. Thank you. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Vice President Sylvia Carey Butler. I apologize. Dr. Sylvia R. Carey Butler, an accomplished higher education leader with deep experience leading diversity and inclusion initiatives, is Brown University's Vice President for Institutional Equity and Diversity. Please join me in welcoming Vice President Carey Butler to the stage.
Thank you, Kevin. Kevin certainly is a testament to the scholarship and academic excellence that exists here at Brown, and that was evidenced by the wonderful panel that we had today. And my only regret is not being a student at Brown and having the opportunity to have professors such as those who made up today's panel. So thank you all for that. I want to start by thanking the Planning Committee and President Paxton for the opportunity to provide closing remarks today. I especially would like to thank President Paxton for the university's continued commitment to speak truth about our history. And a special thanks to Dr. Simmons for her bold, inclusive, and transformative leadership in appointing the original steering committee, a committee that itself embodied diversity and perspectives, disciplines, and identity. It is against this backdrop of the Slavery and Justice Report, coupled with the university's DIAP, that I was attracted to this position. The launching of the Pathways to Diversity and Inclusion Action Plan in 2016 served as a guiding framework for diversity and inclusion and would take Brown and place Brown and signal to the campus community and to all of higher education that Brown University had positioned itself to address aggressively and boldly issues of racism and discrimination and non-inclusion that has existed throughout its history. The DIAP went from a well-formulated concept to a tool that gave the entire campus ownership and responsibility for creating a more inclusive community. It helped to illuminate and provide a pathway for Brown to be the standard bearer for diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education. I applaud the big and small gains that have been accomplished through the university's approach to equity and justice, and understand, as noted before, that there is still work to be done. However, what excites me about the implementation of the DIAP Phase 2 is its pursuit of excellence from the entire campus community. Now here we are, 5 years later, with DIAP Phase 2 having been launched, the second edition of the Slavery and Justice Report having been released. The work for the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice is embedded in the ethos of the university and is facilitating our learning about history and contemporary challenges that divide us, seeking to build bridges across that divide while telling our truth. As I embark on this role, I am cognizant of where we are and where we aspire to go, and what we hope to achieve through our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Please know that I am committed to this work, and I am excited about this new phase we find ourselves in. And I look forward to the ongoing collaborations across this university, to holding ourselves, myself, and all of us accountable so that we can continue to thrive. In the words of James Baldwin, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. Thank you.
Yeah, let me just say thank you all very, very much. Our gracious president has said, why don't you just say thank you, Tony? So I would just want to say thank you all very much for coming to this program. I think it was a very important moment in the history of Brown. I would repeat my thanks to all the persons who were involved, but most of all to thank you all who braved the weather to be here. and to say there's a reception outside, and the president has kindly made available, again through her graciousness and kindness, the second edition of the Slavery and Justice Report. Thank you all very much.